So we close on the seventh Mishnah, and we concluded, the seventh Mishnah concluded, or it was in the middle of a series of discussions about interchanges between the public and the private domain. And we're going to pick up those interchanges in the Mishnayot we're going to look at tonight. But before we get into discussions about relationships between the public and the private domain, we get off into a little bit of an excursus about trees. And I have to say, I'm not quite, as you know, I'm always trying to think through what the structure of the Mishnah is. And I found it difficult to really understand what the structure of this Mishnah is, although you can see it has relationships to the underpasses, and it has relationships with, measures of height in a public domain. So maybe that is what is going on. But anyway, for whatever reason, we are going to take a little diversion now into tree space. And then we'll come back to public and private. Ilan shehu mesech al haaretz, a tree that overshadows the ground. If it's not more than 3 hands breadths off the ground, we can carry underneath it. And we've learned before that 3 hands breadth is a sort of a critical distance for contact. And effectively, if this tree is within 3 hands breadths of the ground, it's considered effectively touching the ground. So you could say, if you like, that we have a canopy over it's a bit like being inside a giant tent. Even though we're out in public space, the tree itself creates private space. It's a bit like carrying inside a tent or carrying inside a corral or a sheep pen. That's effectively what the tree is like. So we can carry inside it. Maybe actually this is the relationship with the public-private remainder of the chapter, that we're essentially creating private space or we're fencing off the public space with the tree as long as its branches come within 3 tefachim of the ground. But we then go off into a segue about another halacha which is completely tree-centered, and generally climbing on trees is forbidden on Shabbat in case we break off a branch. And the Mishnah is interested, well, what does it mean to climb a tree? What if the roots stick up above the ground? And that's really where the next part of the Mishnah goes. Sharashav gavohin min haaretz. What if the tree roots stuck up above the ground? Shlosha tvachim, 3 hands breadths. So we're using the same critical factor, but this time we're using it to measure height rather than using it to measure contact with the ground. So the same critical 3 hands breadths, 3 tefachim. Sharashav gavohin min haaretz shlosha tvachim. Lo yeshev alehem. You shouldn't sit on them, because at this point the roots are considered a bit like the branches, basically, that we wouldn't climb on in case we broke them on Shabbat. And then, but this is a bigger jump right away. We're jumping almost tangentially connected to trees. Hadelet shebamuk tzeh. A door in a muktzeh. A muktzeh here is not a muktzah object. Muktzah, by the way, just means set aside. But a muktzeh is a sort of yard behind the house, a storehouse, basically, where you put stuff, a bit like a shed. And as I understand it, the doors on these sheds were not fixed. So you had to basically lift it, you had to carry it over to the shed to fix it. So it's a movable object. And gosh, if we fix it on the shed, maybe we're actually building onto the shed. Now, we learned earlier in the Mishnah of Shabbat that you can actually hang a window on a house without being considered to be building, because it's a prepared object. But somehow the Mishnah seems to consider this sort of portable door as building, because it says, Ein noalin, we don't close off with this door in the muktzeh, hadelet sheba muktzeh, and we similarly with chadachim sheba pirtza, or with thorns, which we've used to close off a hole in the wall. This might be the connection with the trees. Or with reed mats, umachsalot. Ein nolin b'hem, we don't close off with them. Ela im ken gavohim min haaretz, unless they're high off the ground. So again, maybe this is the connection with the earlier part of the Mishnah. If they're 3 tefachim off the ground, we seem to be able to use them, either because we're not worried about the appearance of building, or one of the commentators suggests that the underlying principle with all of these is that we don't want to drag stuff along the ground and make furrows. And maybe if they're off the ground, we're not dragging. So yes, perhaps the link between these three different halachot in this Mishnah is that they all depend on height from the ground. Maybe that's the secret key, actually, that joins these three parts of the Mishnah together. They're all about how high stuff is off the ground. And once we've dealt with these three, we go back to questions of public and private. And we're going to go back to the person who is standing in a private domain and doing something in public. And I want to remind us that when we looked at this Mishnah, which was in chapter, just a few Mishnayot actually, in, I think, Mishnah 4. Let's just go back to Mishnah 4 in the 10th chapter. Remember, we had the picture. We had the picture of a ledge outside a window. And we learned that we can put objects on the ledge or take them off on Shabbat. And then we learned in general, Omer Adam b'reshut hayached u'mitzaltel b'reshut harabim. A person can stand in private space and kind of stretch his hand out and move objects in public space. And it works the other way too. B'reshut harabim u'mitzaltel b'reshut hayached, and stand in public space and move things in private space if he reaches his hand in. Provided he doesn't take them more than 4 cubits. So provided we don't actually carry in public space, we could stand in private space and move something in public space, and we could go vice versa as well. So that's what we learned in Mishnah 4. Now, Rabbi Meir in our Mishnah is going to come with a different opinion. So now we're in Mishnah 9, and Rabbi Meir is going to object. Lo ya'amod adam b'reshut hayachid. A person should not stand in private space. V'yiftach b'reshut harabim, and open. This is opening a door. This is probably opening a lock in a door. It's certainly opening a door. So you're standing in private space. You're stretching your hand out through the window, and you're going to push a door open in public space, or you're going to unlock it probably. And he works the other way. Maybe you stand in public space and open in private space. And Rabbi Meir says, yeah, you can't do this. Unless you build a mechitza 10 tefachim high around your public space. So maybe you want to open a door. Maybe you want to open, I don't know, the front door of your house. So you want to reach your hand out of a window and open, I don't know, you want to open a door, maybe that's actually, the door would have to be outside your house. Well, maybe if you built a mechitza around it, you could do that, according to Rabbi Meir. And the sages object. They object. Amrulo, Maaseh b'shuk shel patzmin. It happened in this a market. A patzmin, it seems to be a fattening, a sort of a market of animals that were fattened up. Shehaya b'Yerushalayim. There was a fattener's market in Jerusalem. Shehayu no'alim u'manichin et ha'mafteach b'chalon shel ha'gabei ha'petach. They'd lock up their shops. They'd put the key in a window above the shop door. And Rabbi Yossi is not going to object to the statement of fact. He says, okay, Rabbi Yossi Omer Shukshel Samarim Haya. Okay, Rabbi Yossi says it was a wool dealer's market. So we might not quite agree as to what market it was, but people seem to be doing this. And I brought you a picture just to show you what's going on. So you're locking up, you're locking the door, but then you're going to reach up. There's a window above the door. And this is very common, by the way, in Roman architecture. You've got an arch over the doorway. So you've got a square doorway, that's the doorway. But then you've got this semicircular window above the door. So you're going to reach up and you're going to put the key into that semicircular window just above the door. That's the situation that the Mishnah seems to be talking about that was happening in either the wool market or the fattener's market in Jerusalem. So that's what they were doing. So it sounds like they were standing in a. So it sounds like they were standing in a public domain. It sounds like they were standing in a public domain. They were shutting the private. They lock their shops. So the door of the shop is private domain. So they stand out in the street. They'd lock their shop, but of course they're not going to carry the key in the public domain. They're not going to carry the key through the streets of Jerusalem. They're not going to carry the key in public space. So having locked up the shop, they're just going to reach up and they're going to pop the key up in the window in private space where it can sit there, presumably till the rest of Shabbat. So Rabbi Meir seems to be overturned in line with, of course, the fourth Mishnah in the chapter. And we're going to have another event. I mean, this idea of proving halacha by recalling an event that happened is a common technique that the Mishnah uses. And we're going to do the same thing for a bolt, which has got a knob at one end. So this is a bolt with a big knob. And the suggestion I don't know whether I brought you the source sheet. Yeah, the suggestion is that this knob thing is sufficiently heavy that you could use it for grinding spices. Jastrow says that this word claustra, clearly it's a Latin word. It's a door bolt which has got some kind of fastening contrivance which is heavy enough that you could actually use as a pestle. So it's a tool, in other words. It's not just a bolt, it's a tool. So neger sheyesh barosho glustra, and bolt which got a glustra on its head, that's some kind of pestle. Rabbi Eliezer oser, Rabbi Yossi matir. Rabbi Eliezer forbids and Rabbi Yossi permits it. And they're going to prove this from an incident. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, ma'aseh ba'kneset she'b'Tiberia. It happened in a synagogue in Tiberias. She'ayu noagim bo heter. Until Rabban Gamliel and the elders came and they forbade them. So they used to do this actually in Tiberias until Rabban Gamliel came along and forbade it. And now Rabbi Yossi is going to say, Rabbi Yossi Omer, it's the other way round. And of course, this is the problem with learning halacha from an event. How do you know you got the right tradition of the event? How do you know you got the right recording? Rabbi Yossi Omer, Isur Nahaguba. Rabbi Yossi says, no, they treated it as forbidden. Ba Rabban Gamliel vehazkenim vehitiru lahen. Rabban Gamliel and the elders came and they permitted them. So we know that we prove the halacha from the event of when the sages and Rabban Gamliel came to Tiberia, but we can't remember which way round it was. So we are in existential doubt.